I define trauma more openly. So it's not just the big T traumas, like those really big observable events on the outside, but also it could be a long extended period of irritation or agitation. If I have like a formalized definition of trauma that I use with my own clients, I say it's any experience, either objective, meaning on the outside or observable from the outside, or subjective, which means what's felt on the inside, that stirs up heightened, intense feelings of feeling out of control, trapped, or ashamed.
Hey guys, it's Melissa Moore. Thanks for joining me for today's episode of Faith, Hope, Love, where we grow together in our faith, increase in hope, and learn how to better love God and love other people. We've got an extra special episode today. We are in our Momentum series where we talk about moving on, moving forward, and moving others. And I have my really good friend, Joanne Kim, who is a licensed marriage family therapist, and she's going to share with us in these next two episodes about toxic relationships and trauma. Today, we're going to dive into trauma. It's a heavy episode, so definitely not if you're with kids to be listening with them, but definitely something that we all need to work through and address in our lives. Joanne, thanks for joining me on the show. And yes, I would love to hear a little bit about you and what you do.
I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in the heart of the Silicon Valley, and so work with a ton of folks who are young professionals or young parents, and mostly use the Enneagram and brain spotting to help people create relationships where their needs matter too. So actually, the topic for this particular episode today is my jam. It's super fun to be able to support people who are big feelers, and oftentimes they're in the healing profession. So either they themselves are therapists or they're pastors, mental health or medical professionals. So a lot of them have big hearts and lots of feelings, because that's really helpful in them connecting to other people's needs as well. But oftentimes they accidentally miss their own.
I mean, the fact that you're doing, I mean, you address so many different needs, but I mean, you are really helping the helpers. I mean, the people that not only do they have their own internal trauma and potentially toxic relationships, but they're helping other people address them. So, I mean, you're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and I just have so much respect for you. And I mean, you're really supporting people that are doing really amazing things. And I mean, you're obviously a big part of that process for them. In a way, you're affecting so many lives. So, I'm seriously thank you for what you do. Um, I mean, I've seen a lot of the videos you do on like Instagram TV. If you, again, for listeners, if you haven't watched any of those, you should definitely hop over. I will be linking that below. But just for your talks to the therapist, can you tell me briefly what that is?
So on Tuesdays at 12 o'clock, I've been recording these 2 to 5 minute Instagram lives on different topics. Every week is a different category. So like the first week is about emotions, the second week about relationships, the third week based on the topic of the month, and then the last week usually is an Ask a Therapist, where people can kind of submit their questions, and then I pick some and then address them on the lives. And so the I keep it kind of short because a lot of people that I work with are pretty busy in all the things that they do, and so those little takeaways are actual conversations I have with clients in session. I must have had them like 40 or 50 times by now. And so people can kind of get a feel for what therapy is like. It's not always super intense and super hard, but it is an opportunity for people to really give space to um, important needs that often kind of get shoved to the side.
I love it. And I think it's neat that you're not just doing serious work within your therapy sessions, but you're also like just giving that to people. I mean, that's really an amazing resource. So, anyways, we're talking about trauma. I would love to kind of just jump on in. Just if you could kind of explain what constitutes trauma, like if there's maybe some potential causes or varying levels of severity, all those types of things.
Just a quick disclaimer, my definition of trauma is broader than how it's formally utilized in the mental health spaces. And part of that is because a lot of the people that I work with haven't necessarily experienced what people consider to be big traumas, like car accidents or parents divorcing or things like that. Oftentimes, since a lot of these individuals are very internally oriented, a lot of them are highly sensitive people, etc. I define trauma more openly. So it's not just the big T traumas, like those really big observable events on the outside, but also it could be a long extended period of irritation or agitation. So, for example, someone who grows up in a home where nobody really acknowledges emotions, or where there's a lot of criticism here and there. So, if the person has grown up living and breathing that as like the norm, they just assume that's kind of a normal experience. It's not until they interact with someone who's grown up in an entirely different environment where they're like, oh, wait. And they look back on their own experiences and they redefine or redescribe what they've been through. So if I have like a formalized definition of trauma that I use with my own clients, I say it's any experience, either objective, meaning on the outside or observable from the outside, or subjective, which means what's felt on the inside, that stirs up heightened, intense feelings of feeling out of control, trapped, or ashamed. And the reason why I broadened this definition, this is not according to the Bible for Therapists, which was called the DSM, so it's not a mental health diagnosis definition. The reason why I expand the definition is because two people can go through the exact same event and have very different takeaways. Like two people can be in the same car when there's a car accident, and one person will, have a really hard time. Like that's going to mark how they move forward in the rest of their lives, feeling really guilty or really afraid all the time. Whereas the other person in the car will be like, oh, I'm so thankful that I'm still alive. So that's one example. Another is, let's say, for a non intense event, like someone who is called out in the middle of their classroom by their teacher, like in fourth or fifth grade, asked to answer a question on the board. Some kids will be like, all right, I'll like rise to the challenge and I'll, show off and see everyone can see what I can do. Whereas another kid is going to turn bright red and they're going to fumble over the words and they're just going to shut down. And that is what might be driving a lot of the things that they do as an adult, working really hard so they're never caught in that position again. So I hope that definition makes it so that a lot of people can consider their own experiences and be like, oh, yeah, that was a really hard experience for me. Like maybe I do need some more support around that. I'm not the only one.
I love that you kind of talk about it as almost like a spectrum, that like it's almost sometimes our culture is very much like you have to have experienced some really crazy event to have had trauma. And it's not that. Like that's not true. And so I would kind of like to see, maybe what your thoughts are on maybe like symptoms that people may be feeling that kind of would, show trauma that's, either buried or like, very obvious trauma. And maybe how you would address some of those symptoms.
In terms of the symptoms, I can use what the DSM uses as kind of outside indicators. So there are four main things to follow. One is what's called re-experiencing. So a person in the present, they're going through a brand new situation with new people, new details, etc. But the situation like reminds them or reminds their body of this scary thing that happened back then. So, intrusive thoughts or memories. Sometimes people may re experience similar sensations in their dream when they're sleeping. Or, they're in the middle of their workday and they have kind of like a very sudden shift in their thoughts or their emotions. So, first one, re experiencing. Second one is avoidance. Because it's so uncomfortable to feel those old feelings, people try really hard to avoid anything that remotely reminds them or their body of what happened back then. So, an example might be a person experiences a really harsh breakup and they try really hard to not even drive on the same streets that they knew they drove down when going to their previous partner's place, which means they're spending a lot of energy and effort trying to not engage with that scary experience or anything that remotely reminds them of it. The third one is what's called negative cognitions and feelings. Understandably, if a person spends a lot of their energy trying to avoid these difficult experiences, even perceived ones, then it's going to shape how they feel about themselves, how they feel about others, the world, etc. It's like, oh, like I'm always going to be in these kinds of relationships, or maybe like I just can't trust other people because other people are just untrustworthy. Or, the state of the world is not great, and it's always going to be this like gloom and doom type of thing out there. Some people who've had at least one big trauma or multiple small traumas, they can live in a way where their perception is colored by their experiences, not actually reflective of what's actually happening in front of them. So again, that's re-experiencing, avoidance, negative cognitions and feelings, and the last one is heightened reactivity, meaning they're generally very irritable. They can be jumpy at different sounds, or their moods can change pretty rapidly or suddenly. And so on a nervous system level, their bodies are kind of in this heightened sense of like something's about to happen, like I better like be extra careful or extra cautious. And so it's exhausting to live life this way. So even when things are actually okay on the outside, when a person's body is always tense, even small things may be enough to kind of tip the scale.
I appreciate, I mean, it's such a thorough explanation. I mean, again, like being able to pull from the DSM and say, like, this is what it actually looks like. But a lot of those things, those are very normal things that a lot of people experience, but they wouldn't write that as trauma. They may not acknowledge that as trauma. What are some things maybe you could do to like alleviate some of those symptoms from those four things?
Is helpful for people to know that their well-intended efforts to try to avoid negative feelings or negative experiences usually backfires. It's like trying to stuff a beach ball underwater. The further down it gets stuffed down, the more pressure buildup there is, and so eventually, like you'll lose control of it, and it'll just pop back up, make a huge splash. Everything gets super wet and messy. So, trauma is an experience where the body's experience feeling out of control or trapped or ashamed. Our bodies are designed to heal itself. And triggers are actually attempts for the body to try to heal itself. It's just that the way by which it's trying to do so, it doesn't always happen at the most convenient moments or the most helpful ways. And so, even let's say when a person gets triggered by, let's say, a word that a friend says, the friend didn't do anything to cause the pain, but the body is like, uh oh, we're going the same place again. So, when the person gets triggered, if we label that as a bad thing, then yeah, the person should try to avoid that situation at all costs. But if we reinterpret that as the body's attempt to try to heal, we get the memo, take the memo, and say, all right, something is going on inside of me that needs attention. I need to attend to this as soon as possible. It might not be while I'm in the middle of a conversation with a friend. It might not be when I'm in the middle of doing work, but I still need to give space to this because otherwise it's going to be that beach ball that gets stuffed underwater. So, part of the way to help oneself heal from trauma is to actually give more space to the uncomfortable experiences, not less. Now, it's kind of like being on a roller coaster. It's super intense. There's lots of loops and lots of dizziness. And, it seems like it's going to last a long time, but it's really like 2 minutes, right? The issue is when people's bodies get triggered, it's kind of like being on that roller coaster, but the roller coaster kind of gets stuck at the top of the ride. Like it doesn't actually make it through the other side. And so because that experience is so intense and the person just tries really hard to get off the roller coaster in the middle of the ride, it's just not going to go down well. So things like brain spotting as a type of therapy is one way for the people to get to the other side towards resolving those difficult intensity of experience. But there can be many other ways of doing so as well. Performance arts or body work like yoga or any kind of like journaling exercise with a person's deliberately giving space to it. It's important to manage just how much intensity they're dealing with at a given time, but it's still important to give more space to it than less. It's a bit counterintuitive than what people may usually expect.
Yeah, I know I've heard some people talk about like, like, oh, or I even myself personally, this is a triggering event for me. I'm just gonna like avoid my triggers. And it's like, but that's not always possible. It's like, okay, so how do we address our triggers and deal with them and say, okay, why is this triggering? Now what do I do? And that's not something that we should do by ourselves. Like having a therapist is very helpful. I know for me, I've had many years of therapy and it's been so, so good. So to deal with those triggers so that they don't disrupt our lives because those things will happen. We will be triggered.
And the thing is, with trauma, the worst event has already happened. It's already in the past. Like, it's one and done. Now, if a person's still in a triggering or like a traumatic situation, yeah, do what you can to try to get out of it as soon as possible. But for most people who've had trauma is a past tense event. The worst part has already happened. It's just that triggers that our bodies engage in say, we're not sure whether that bad thing has actually come to an end. And so, what's more likely is that what's happening right now, the current relationship that you're in, the current work situation that you've gotten yourself into, is more likely to be technically better than what's happened back then, but your body just doesn't know how to tell the difference. And so, it's really hard to make sound decisions when we're in a lot of confusion. So, connecting with a therapist is one way by which we can kind of have other frames of reference so that we can retrain our bodies to know that what's happening right in front of us should be considered as a brand new event, not as an exact replica of what happened back then. I work with a lot of people who are in romantic relationships, and their partner kind of has a way about them where they're like ignoring emotions. Yeah, the partner really does have to do their own work for sure. But the way that the body interprets what's happening, it's as if it was the same as, when they're getting criticized growing up, or when back then when they were really vulnerable, they really didn't have any way of soothing themselves. And that's hard to expect the partner to be able to do the heavy lifting on behalf of those old previous people.
I mean, that makes sense. I mean, and we'll talk more about toxic relationships next week, but I want to kind of get back, I mean, that idea that, I mean, trauma is something that we have to address on a personal level. We can't expect everyone else to kind of like gently walk around us. It's just not, it's not healthy to live that way. And I mean, again, we will be triggered at some point. I know you've mentioned with me before, like the neurobiology and like some like theology surrounding trauma. So I just would kind of love to hear your thoughts on that. How do we include God in the healing process?
There's such intricacy in how our bodies are meant to work together. It's not just about thinking soundly and downplaying emotions or doing the right thing. All of these are very much interconnected. And that's even reflective in several parts of Scripture. One of my favorite parts is in Romans 12. Now, that's the part where people have memorized like verses 1 and 2. So it's like, therefore, brothers, in view of God's mercy, like offer your bodies as holy sacrifices, uh, as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is a spiritual act of worship. And then verse 2 is like, you know, make sure to like renew your minds, so that you don't align with the way that the world operates. And so the first two verses are talking about the body and talking about the mind, and the emotions kind of like come in like verses 5 and 6 at the end. But even then, there's interconnection with how these things operate. And so it would be doing a great disservice to us, and it would be kind of dishonoring to God to consider that only one part of us is really important and ignoring the rest. So it's kind of like splitting hairs sometimes to think about our thoughts, our emotions, and our body experiences as being distinct. They definitely have different roles, but there's so much interconnection, and there's so much order to them that I think it does highlight kind of the majestic works that God really does, and that it's not just about memorizing and reciting the proper verses. And it's not about, giving full control and full reins to our emotions, but that we're supposed to heal in a very integrated way. So another example of that is uh, Jesus with the bleeding woman. There's a lot of layers of healing done in that one particular experience. Now, he could have just fix the physical portion, the physical ailment of it, and then the woman would have probably been happy enough that she got that portion of healing. But then there's this whole interaction with making sure that she hangs out a little bit longer in this huge crowd of people, where that's healing for the soul portion, that she, who's been kind of pushed to the side in the outskirts of society, is given center stage for everyone to see that she is a beloved daughter. That's retraining the mind and how she sees herself. That's also retraining other people's minds on how they should consider her. And it's also a heightened emotional, intense experience. When I said earlier, one of the uh, things that marks an event as being traumatic is when it involves heightened emotion of being ashamed. Well, Jesus put this woman front and center saying, like, you are beloved, like, you are worthy. And it's not because your bleeding problem has been resolved, but because she is who she is. She is an image bearer of God. If you read through parts of the Bible through that lens about how our thoughts, our emotions, and our bodies are very much interconnected, then you won't see just physical healings for people. Let's say when Jesus interacts with different individuals, you'll see that there's so many other aspects of pain that Jesus also healed them from.
I love that. I mean, so we just actually just wrapped up this Life and Teachings of Jesus series, and we talked about the woman, well, one, the woman at the well, and then also the bleeding woman, that they both have these really heavy, I mean, not just like single event trauma experiences, but like repeated, toxic relationships, trauma experiences. And like Jesus just steps into the middle with just like this heart of love and compassion. And it's like it literally changes their lives in an instant. And like what you're saying, it's not that like God looked at them once they were healed and now you're good. It was like even pre healing, like he just had such love for them. And I mean, it's like if he can look at these women like that, he also looks at us that way. And I think that's a huge, to me at least, has been a huge part of my healing from previous traumas, is knowing that like my identity is not anchored in this past traumatic event, but my identity is in Christ. And I think it's through that faith response and clinging to God. I mean, obviously with therapy, medication, all the things that need to happen for health and healing. But that is a huge, huge thing. I think a lot of people that need hope, that need to feel that they are loved.
I mean, the cool thing is, God wants our healing more than we want our own healing. It's a huge part of it. It's like, it's not just about God changing our citizenship status to like being citizens of heaven. That's easy. But it's about us catching up with what our status really means, in not just technically having access to his kingdom and having some perks that go with it, but like really being an inhabitant. And I think, even the language around adoption is another example of that. It's like, I've heard a story of adoptees who technically they became sons and daughters of a family, but it took a long while until they were able to live knowing that they're sons and daughters. It's an entirely different experience altogether. And so I don't think it's just about having a technical change in one's status, like um, getting enough trauma therapy so that you no longer have a mental health diagnosis of PTSD. No, like there's so many needs that are super important, and beyond just symptom management, like God really wants for people to receive his powerful healing from the inside out in all arenas of our life.
For sure. It makes me think too. I mean, so like some people that are listening to this may not know what these two terms are, and I'll explain them briefly. But justification versus sanctification, like it's these, Christian-y terms, whatever. But justification is like this idea that like as soon as we believe in Jesus, that he's, he died on the cross for us, rose from the dead. As soon as we believe in that, our relationship with God is like made whole and made right. But sanctification is like this lifelong process of like growing and healing and like our relationship improving with God and all the aspects of our humanity, hopefully moving forward. And It's something that, yeah, it's not like an easy process. It's painful at times, just like trauma work and therapy is painful, but it's so cool. Like when you are able to come out the other side and you've experienced at least some level of healing, you can then bring hope and healing to other people. And that's so powerful. I would love, I mean, obviously you're a therapist. I would love to kind of hear about, when you're in therapy with a client working through trauma, what are some of the techniques that you might use within a therapy session?
Well, one of my favorite ones I mentioned earlier is the Enneagram, because as I've mentioned earlier, two people can go through the exact same event and have very different takeaways because internally their personalities are completely different. They're focusing on different themes, different needs, different fears. And so, unless we attune to each person for who they actually are, it's going to be hard for them to find the deep healing that they need. Two people can have anxiety, but for very different reasons. One person is because they're putting themselves, they're comparing themselves to an unbelievably high standard, and they'll never find themselves as being able to hit the mark. Whereas another person has anxiety because they're super self-conscious about how other people see them. And so unless we really know like what is going on internally within the person's personality, which is the way that the person has coped through life, it's going to take a while. Otherwise, it's kind of like throwing a bunch of things at them and hoping that something sticks.
I enjoy the Enneagram as well. Like, I think I don't know, I'm sure there'll be some people listening that are not going to feel this way, and that's fine. You can feel that way, it's fine. But there's something that I've found with understanding kind of the way that I'm wired internally by God, who's created me in his image, yes, but as a human being, there are certain things that trigger me more than other things. And it wasn't until I realized, oh, that's why that's triggering me, and now I can fix, at least somewhat work on it, or just, okay, like, so for me, like I'm a 3. So it's like, I'm so desire to be driven, and I want to move forward. And as soon as someone tells me that like I'm not doing a good job, like, oh, it's just like kills me. And it's not that that's traumatic, but if you put, so much of that, that can add up to trauma.
The metaphor that I use with the Enneagram, it's like you go to a massage therapist and they ask you a bunch of questions like, okay, what would you like attention around today? And are there any areas that you want to avoid? Let's look for some knots that are built into your body so that we can massage them out, and so you can gain full access to your whole body all over again. 'Cause otherwise, those knots are just pulling away at different areas for extended periods of time. Brain spotting, which is a form of trauma therapy, is the actual like massaging out of those knots. And so it's a type of trauma therapy that our bodies naturally know how to do. If you kind of imagine, you having had a hard experience, and then you go to sleep, and then in the deep like dreaming process, your brain is coming up with all kinds of weird details and scenarios and things like that that don't make any sense. But then that's kind of how your body metabolizes or works through a lot of those difficult emotional situations. Brain spotting is when a person does that while they're awake in therapy. And instead of them kind of, falling into the deep end, the therapist is basically someone who's able to pull them out of that deep water when the session is about to end because time's run out, or because things kind of get really intense, more intense than is the person feels like they can tolerate. So those are the two main resources that I use when supporting people with different kinds of trauma. A lot of the work that I do is around relationships and difficult emotions. So I also do a lot of teaching too about what each emotion means, about what the person needs. And so they're not as chaotic and random as people think they are. There is an order and logic to it. It's just that it doesn't follow the same rules as intellectual logic.
I mean, this is a whole nother topic, but like emotional intelligence, it's like, I think sometimes whether we've gone through trauma or not, like sometimes it's easier to avoid those negative emotions. And so sometimes we have to like sit down with someone that's trained, that understands how do we address anger, how do we address frustration, whatever it is, any type of negative emotion, because our culture is very much like, oh, you're feeling angry, stop it, or you're feeling frustrated, stop it. And instead, we need to figure out why we're feeling those things so we can actually stretch and grow those muscles, and we can actually like use them to not just benefit us but also like benefit the people that we love and serve. So Gosh, I love it. I feel like I need to get some brain spotting done. That sounds really interesting. And I think, I mean, it's just like, it sounds like a really cool tool to, yeah, just really help people to allow themselves to feel those intense emotions in the trauma, but in a way that's safe. And obviously with someone that's going to shepherd them well and help them process through that well. Is there anything else that you kind of want to add on trauma before we move on?
As I mentioned earlier, the worst part has already happened. And so even when we experience reminders of that, they are short and they can be overcome, but a lot of it involves a lot of courage and encouragement. We were never meant to heal from our experiences alone. And so, really connecting with a lot of safe people where you can take off all your masks and you can show up as yourself, and you're not going to be judged. It's like a really important factor. It's an essential factor that people need for them to do the healing work. So, aside from a therapist, like, friends or sometimes family members is kind of up in the air depending on each person's family of origin. But our partners might be a huge agent of healing for us. And so, it definitely is possible to work through these super scary experiences. And it's so worth it. It's so worth doing the work. And until then, it might be hard to imagine it. So until that time, you're safe people, including maybe your therapist or pastor or whoever. You may borrow the hope they have on your behalf. So it's okay if you feel scared or unsure.
Yeah, when you're like at the beginning of that trauma processing stage, like hope doesn't feel possible, but like you know that there's someone, yeah, either your pastor, your therapist, God, even that they have hope for you, and we can lean into that when we don't have it. So, we're gonna in the next episode we're gonna talk about toxic relationships, but I would love just to hear a little bit about how people can follow you. I know you're a therapist in the state of California, but also like with social media, Instagram, TV, website, how can people follow you?
Yeah. So my practice is called OliveMe Counseling. And you can find me on Facebook, Instagram. I do the weekly Instagram lives. I am currently working on building an e-course on emotions, as I've mentioned earlier. And it's pretty easy to find me. If you like literally look up Enneagram therapy, I'm probably like one of the first people to come up with that. So that's the quick tip of how to find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode on trauma. Join us back here next week as we come back again with Joanne Kim, LMFT, for our episode on toxic relationships. All right. Have a great week. See you next week.